Hi, my name is Susie Gordon and I'm an editor working at Tender Leaves Translation. I'm delighted to introduce this course titled Introduction, an Overview of Literary Translation by Shelley Bryant. Across 6 modules, Shelley will take you through all the ins and outs of the literary translation and publishing industry so that you can take your first steps towards a career as a literary translator. Here is an excerpt from her course.
Another example of how sometimes words can match and yet there will still be a cultural mismatch comes in an example that I've seen, a translation from English to Chinese, which is the phrase 做你自己. Now, the phrase itself sounds a little bit, I would say, odd compared to normal usage of Chinese. It is a popular phrase these days, but it comes from be yourself, the English phrase be yourself. And from the first time that I heard this word being used in Chinese, this phrase being used in Chinese, I really didn't like it as a translation. And there are several reasons for it. It's not really because of the awkwardness of the language, though I do find it feels a little bit awkward, but instead it has to do with a cultural mismatch between the phrases be yourself and 做你自己, although linguistically they are perfectly compatible. And where I see the problem coming in is that be yourself comes from a culture in which individualism is valued. In fact, you can say it is perhaps the highest value within English language cultures. And on the reverse side of that is the phrase in Chinese comes from is situated in a culture where communalism is valued, or the social aspects, your place in society is valued. And again, it is perhaps the highest value in Chinese-speaking culture. So with this being the case, it changes what these phrases mean within their cultures. In English, the phrase be yourself is casual, it's low-key, and it's expressing a cultural norm. Just relax, be yourself. There's nothing out of the ordinary or in any sense that is countercultural, if you want to use that term, about the phrase. It's a very easygoing kind of phrase, and it fits quite naturally into conversation, as asking you to be natural as well. Now, the Chinese phrase is quite different. It's a bold, daring phrase, even transgressive. And now I say transgressive because it's partly linguistically, it's not really very beautiful sounding. It doesn't have an easy natural sound to it necessarily, but also because it's going against what the cultural values are. And for this reason, I feel that be yourself and 做你自己 are really not very matched, not matched well as phrases, not because of the linguistic problem or not because of the words, but because of the cultural values placed on those words and where these words are fitting in the respective cultures. Now, I've also seen this phrase 做你自己, the Chinese phrase, appear in a different place as a translation for a different phrase. And this came as subtitles in a film when I was watching The Rise of Skywalker. And Princess Leia says to Rey, "Don't be afraid of who you are." Now, I find this is an interesting study for us because you can see that 做你自己, if you understand both languages, you can see that it's a very clear-cut translation of be yourself. The words very much match with be yourself. Now, we don't really get that same matching of words between the phrase don't be afraid of who you are and 做你自己. Don't be afraid of who you are is a much longer phrase. It's not as compact, obviously, but it's an interesting case study to look at how it relates to this translated version, this Chinese version, which is translated from an English phrase in the first place. Because, as we talked about, the Chinese is a bit bold, a bit daring, and a bit transgressive. Now, I would not say the same of this phrase that Princess Leia says to Rey in The Rise of Skywalker. Instead, it is more reassuring and accepting and encouraging. And yet, I still feel that 做你自己 as a translation is much better suited to this phrase, don't be afraid of who you are, in the context of the film. Although the two messages that are being analyzed here, if we look at the bold, daring, transgressive nature of the Chinese and the reassuring, accepting, encouraging nature of the English, it might seem there's a bit of a mismatch. But at the same time, in the context of the film particularly, what Princess Leia was saying to Rey was, embrace who you are, even though it won't be well received by others. So, while this phrase, don't be afraid of who you are, is not necessarily transgressive linguistically in the same sense that Tuonitsuji kind of feels to the ear, it still is encouraging Rey to do the very thing that is transgressive about the phrase Tuonitsuji, which is, don't worry about what others think of you. You just do your own thing, and you don't be afraid of who you are. So this is a case where we see linguistically, or on the word level, there's less of a match between the two phrases, and yet it seems that it works better in translation. So if we are to compare these two phrases, I would say that 做你自己 is actually a better translation of don't be afraid of who you are in that particular context of the Star Wars film than it is of the general phrase be yourself. Are there times where be yourself might have some of that connotation that is more transgressive? Perhaps in a certain context, but at the same time, that's not generally how we understand it. Now, if I were back translating 做你自己 into English, I actually wouldn't use either of these phrases. Instead, I would probably use a little bit more contemporary look to it. The phrase that you will hear used more frequently today than you would have heard in the past when we talk about this kind of concept of being yourself. And that's in English. You hear people today quite often saying, you do you. Now, I feel this phrase, you do you, has something similar to it about the Chinese phrase. Now, we talked about the bold, daring, transgressive nature of 做你自己. And while that transgressive and that daring and that boldness are all happening on the cultural level, there is also an element in which that linguistic side feels the same way. It has the feeling of boldness and daring and transgressiveness. And I would say that similarly, we have you do you, which has this phrase, which is reassuring and accepting, like the phrase don't be afraid of who you are, or even like be yourself. And yet it has something transgressive about it. Not culturally, but linguistically. It's awkward in English to say this phrase, and every time I hear it, I'm a little irritated by it. It kind of grates on me. But it is a very good back translation of the idea of 做你自己. So I feel that what we can look at here is that although the original translation, that Chinese phrase, is being translated from be yourself, and linguistically they're a good match. There's no question about that. But what we have happening here is that culturally, it's perhaps a better match for a different phrase that's not quite as close to it in the linguistic pattern. So I think that this is a very good example for us to consider when we think about words matching and yet the culture sometimes still being mismatched.